Daniel Whitaker's hands were shaking, not from cold, not from fear, but from the kind of rage a man feels when he realizes he has been robbed in plain daylight by people he trusted. The ledger spread across his desk told the story in coal black ink, $2,300 in debt and counting. Behind him, the woman he had hired as a cook 3 weeks ago stood with her arms crossed, her voice steady as iron in a fire. "You're being robbed blind, Mr. Whitaker. Every supplier, every buyer. They see a desperate man and they're bleeding you dry." He turned slowly, shame and fury warring in his chest. "You telling me how to run my ranch?" She didn't flinch. "No, I'm telling you how to save it. If this story moves you, subscribe and stay until the very end and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled." The summer of 1882 pressed down on Red Creek Ranch like a hot iron on wet cloth, relentless, suffocating leaving marks that wouldn't fade. Daniel Whitaker stood at the window of his office in the pre-dawn dark, watching the first gray light climb over the Texas hill country, and tried to remember the last time he had felt anything other than tired. He was 38 years old and he felt 60. The ranch had been his father's before it was his, a working spread of 400 acres in the limestone country west of Austin, with good grass when the rains came and decent water from the creek that cut through the eastern pasture. His father had built it with his hands and his stubbornness in 20 years of brutal work. Daniel had inherited it 6 years ago when the old man's heart finally gave out, and he had spent every day since then trying to hold it together with increasingly fraying rope. The numbers didn't lie. He'd learned that much. He turned back to the desk and opened the ledger again, though he already knew what it said. $2,300 in outstanding debt. Feed suppliers therefore threatening to stop extending credit. The cattle buyer in Fort Worth who'd been paying him less and less each season, always with a smooth explanation about market fluctuations and transport costs that Daniel couldn't quite argue against because he didn't have the numbers to counter with. The fence along the north quarter was failing, which meant cattle losses, which meant more debt. And Calvin Briggs, his neighbor to the north, had been buying up water rights, quietly parcel by parcel, like a man who had decided that patience was its own kind of weapon. Daniel closed the ledger again. The sound it made hitting the desk was like a judge's gavel. Outside boots scraped against the porch boards. Tom Crawford, his foreman, appeared in the doorway, a weathered man of 52, with a face like old saddle leather and eyes that missed nothing. Tom had been with the ranch since Daniel's father's time, and he carried that history in every crease of his face. "Boss?" Tom turned his hat in his hands, which he only did when he was about to say something he'd rather not. "There's a woman out front asking for work." Daniel didn't look up. "We're not hiring." I told her that. "And she's still waiting." A pause. "She walked here from town." That made Daniel look up. Juniper Creek was 5 miles away along a dirt road that turned to packed dust in summer and sucked mud in winter. It was a brutal walk in ordinary weather. In July, it was something else entirely. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Says she can cook." Daniel almost laughed. The sound would have come out bitter, so he swallowed it. "Tom, I can barely make payroll for the hands I've got. I'm not bringing on a cook. You might want to talk to her first." Tom shifted his weight, uncomfortable in a way that told Daniel his foreman was genuinely uncertain. Tom Crawford was not a man who admitted uncertainty easily. "She's not what you'd expect." Daniel rose from his chair because Tom Crawford's uncertainty was in its own way more persuasive than any argument. He walked through the main house and out the front door into the already bright morning. She stood in the yard beside a worn leather suitcase, her dark dress dusty from the road, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a straw hat that had seen better years. She was perhaps 35, perhaps 40, the kind of woman whose age was hard to guess because she held herself with a stillness that came not from youth, but from something more deliberate, no fidgeting, no nervous glancing away. When Daniel walked out onto the porch, she met his eyes directly and without apology. "I'm Eliza Hartley," she said. "I heard you might need a cook." "You heard wrong." "I don't think I did." Her voice was calm and educated, the vowels shaped somewhere other than Texas. "You have 8 men working this ranch. They're eating whatever they can manage themselves, which means they're eating poorly, which means they're working poorly. A good cook costs money, but a poor diet costs more." The assessment was so precise and delivered so flatly that it took Daniel a moment to respond. "Ma'am, I appreciate you making the walk, but how much are you losing to spoiled food?" she interrupted. and there was nothing rude in her tone, only the quality of a woman accustomed to asking questions that mattered. To improperly stored supplies, to men too exhausted and malnourished to give you a full day's work. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's not your concern. It isn't, she agreed, but it could be. She picked up her suitcase with both hands. I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Whitaker. I'm proposing a business arrangement. I cook. I organize your kitchen and your supply chain. I reduce waste. You pay me room board and $10 a month. $10. His last cook, a mediocre man named Henderson, who'd burned half of what he made and stolen the rest, had cost him 16. Daniel studied the woman in front of him, looking for the catch, the angle, the desperation that would explain why someone was offering this deal. Why so cheap, he asked. Her expression didn't change. Because I need a place to stay more than I need money right now. The honesty of it cut through his suspicion like a blade. He'd been in that position himself, desperate enough to take whatever was offered, and he recognized it in the economy of her words. Where are you coming from, Chicago? That's a long way. Yes, she offered nothing more. Tom cleared his throat from the doorway behind Daniel. Boss, the men have been complaining again about the food situation. Henderson's been gone 3 weeks, and, I know. Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking at Eliza Hartley and trying to calculate risk against need. The truth was that 2 men had already quit since Henderson left, both of them citing the conditions, and he couldn't afford to lose more hands. He couldn't afford to hire a cook either, but Tom was right that there was a cost to not having one, and he was tired of trying to pretend otherwise. 2 weeks, he said finally. Trial period. If it doesn't work out, you move on. No hard feelings. Something shifted in Eliza's eyes, not quite relief, not quite triumph, but the quiet settling of a person who has been holding very still for a very long time. Understood. Tom will show you the bunkhouse kitchen. Daniel paused. It's not much. I've worked with less, she said, and something in her voice told him she meant it precisely. The kitchen was worse than not much. It was in Eliza's private assessment, a monument to neglect, grease coating every surface in overlapping layers like geological strata, the stove so deeply embedded in grime that the iron beneath was invisible, supplies scattered without logic or system across shelves that hadn't been wiped down since Henderson's predecessor left. The flour bin had been left open, and something small and persistent had been inside it. She did not let her expression show any of this. She set her suitcase in the small room attached to the kitchen, a space barely large enough for the narrow cot and washstand it contained, and then she rolled up her sleeves, tied on her apron, and began. 3 hours later, when the ranch hands filed in from the evening work, they stopped in the kitchen doorway as a group. The room was clean. Not just wiped down, actually clean, smelling of lye soap and fresh bread with surfaces that caught the lamplight. On the table sat a meal that made several grown men go temporarily silent: roast beef with a dark, savory gravy, boiled potatoes with butter, fresh carrots, and biscuits that were still warm enough to steam when you split them. A young hand named Billy Cates spoke first. He was maybe 19, with a face that hadn't finished deciding what it would look like, and he stared at the table with an expression that was almost reverent. "Ma'am," he said carefully, as if afraid the food might disappear if he spoke too loud, is all this for us?" "Sit down before it gets cold," Eliza said, wiping her hands on her apron. They sat, they ate, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel heard his ranch hands laughing over a meal. Real laughter, the kind that comes from men who are fed and warm and feel for a moment like the world is making some kind of sense. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Eliza move through the space with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Every motion had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. When she caught him watching, she raised one eyebrow with the precise amount of challenge that was not quite rude. "Problem, Mr. Whitaker. Where did you learn to cook like this?" "Practice." She turned back to the stove. He should have let it go. "The men seem happy." "Men are always happy when they're properly fed." She adjusted the pot on the back burner without looking at him. "You should eat too. You look half-starved." No one had talked to him that way in years, not since his wife Margaret had been alive, and even Margaret, God rest her, had been gentler about it. He should have been offended. Instead, he found himself sitting down at the table and accepting the plate that Eliza set in front of him without ceremony or sentiment. The food was better than good. It was the kind of meal that made you remember what home was supposed to feel like before life got complicated and the ledger started winning. Tom mentioned you walked from town, he said after a moment. I did. That's 5 miles, in this heat. 5 and a quarter. She was washing dishes at the basin, her back to him, her voice neutral. Why not take the stage? A brief pause. Because I spent my last money on supplies I thought you'd need. Flour, salt, proper lard. The stage would have cost another $1. Daniel set down his fork. She had spent her last money on supplies for a job she hadn't been certain she'd get. And she'd mentioned it now as a matter of fact, not as a play for sympathy. You could have asked for that money up front, he said quietly. I could have. She didn't turn around. But then you would have thought I was taking advantage. This way you know I'm serious. She was right. They both knew she was right. Daniel picked up his fork again and said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't reveal more than he wanted to. The next morning she was up before anyone else, and when Daniel emerged from the main house in the pre-dawn gray, the smell of coffee and bacon was already drifting across the yard. The men came into breakfast, real breakfast eggs and bacon and cornbread, and they talked about the day's work and with an energy he hadn't seen from them in months. She's something, Tom said, pointing and beside Daniel with his own coffee cup. His voice was careful, the tone of a man who was adjusting his assessment of a situation. She's efficient, Daniel agreed and caught the faint amusement on his foreman's face at the deliberate understatement. She asked me last night about our supply orders. Tom's voice shifted slightly, becoming more considered. Wanted to know who we buy from, how often, what we pay per unit. Daniel turned to look at him. Why? Said she noticed we were going through flour faster than we should for 8 men. Wanted to make sure the bags weren't being shortchanged on weight. Tom took a sip of his coffee. I told her what I knew. A cook who checked weights. Daniel filed that away, not sure yet what to make of it, and turned back toward the house. Over the following weeks, small changes accumulated, the way water accumulates in low ground, quietly without announcement, until suddenly there was a great deal of it. The food improved steadily. The kitchen became a gathering place rather than a chore to endure. Eliza established a system where the hands took turns with dishes after supper, which produced grumbling, until she made clear without raising her voice that men who didn't help didn't get seconds. The grumbling stopped. But Daniel was also noticing other things. She was up late most nights writing in a small notebook by lamplight at the kitchen table. He saw it twice when he came in for water. Her bent over the pages, her handwriting small and precise, pausing to think before she wrote. She asked questions that a cook had no particular reason to ask about the rotation schedule. Schedule for the cattle, about which hands worked, which sections of fence line, about when the last survey of the north pasture had been done. And once coming in from the barn earlier than expected, he found her standing in front of the cattle count board on the wall beside his office door, studying it with the focused attention of someone reading a document they expected to need to quote from later. You interested in ranching, Miss Hartley? He asked from behind her, and she startled, the only time he'd seen her caught off guard. She closed the notebook she was holding with one smooth motion. Just curious about how things work. Most cooks don't care how many head we're running. I'm not most cooks. She gathered her things with calm efficiency. Good night, Mr. Whitaker. She was gone before he could push further, leaving him standing in the hallway with the cattle count board and more questions than he'd started with. The supply delivery in the following Tuesday changed things. Daniel was in the yard when the feed wagon rolled in from Austin, a driver he'd dealt with a dozen times, a man named Cassidy, who was punctual and pleasant and, as it would turn out, dishonest. Eliza emerged from the kitchen as the hands started unloading the bags, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked over to the wagon with the unhurried purpose she brought to everything. She lifted one of the flour sacks, held it for a moment, feeling the weight. These aren't 50-pound bags, she said. Cassidy's face shifted through something that was almost amusement before settling on offense. Sure they are. Same as always. No. Eliza set the bag down. These are 45 pounds, maybe less. She looked at Daniel, who had come over from the fence he'd been mending. Weigh them. Daniel felt a flash of irritation at being told what to do on his own property, at the scene being made in front of his hands, at the implication that he hadn't been watching this himself. Miss Hartley. Weigh them, she said again, and something in her voice was not a suggestion. It was a statement of what was going to happen next. Right now, you have a scale in the barn. Cassidy's face had gone red. Lady, I don't have time to stand here while you... Then you don't have time to sell to Red Creek Ranch. Eliza turned to Daniel and her eyes were steady and waiting. Mr. Whitaker, the scale. He held her gaze for 3 long seconds. Then, Tom, bring out the scale. 4 minutes later, Cassidy was climbing back onto his wagon with the color of someone who has been caught and knows it. Every bag was underweight, not by accident, by the same amount consistently, which meant deliberately. Every bag the ranch had received from the supplier for however long they'd been dealing was short. Daniel waited until the wagon was gone before he turned to Eliza. How did you know? She brushed dust from her hands. You lift enough 50-pound bags, you learn to feel the difference. And you've lifted that many because I managed a hotel kitchen in Chicago, Mr. Whitaker. She met his eyes with the composure of someone delivering information she has calculated the effect of. A large one. We fed 300 people a day. I know when someone is cheating on weights. The silence that followed had a particular quality. Daniel felt something shift in his understanding of the woman standing in front of him, a recalibration so significant it was almost physical. Why didn't you say that when you applied for work? A small pause. Because you wouldn't have believed me. I might have... No. Her voice was gentle but absolute. A woman arrives alone, claims she managed a major hotel kitchen, and asked for a job cooking on a failing cattle ranch. You would have assumed she was lying or delusional or both. You might have given me a chance eventually, but not on the first day. She looked at him evenly. So I showed you what I could do instead of telling you what I'd done. She had been managing him since the moment she arrived. Reading him, calculating him, presenting herself in the precise form most likely to produce the outcome she needed. It should have made him angry. Instead, looking at the gate where Cassidy's wagon had disappeared at the scale Tom was carrying back to the barn, he felt something that was uncomfortably close to respect. That supplier's been shortchanging me for how long? He asked. I'd estimate 6 months, possibly longer. And how much has that cost me? Enough to matter. A pause. Mr. Whitaker, if you'd allow me to review your supply accounts, all of them, I could tell you exactly. There it was, the real offer finally on the table. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. A cook who managed hotel kitchens, who checked weights, who took notes at night and studied cattle counts and asked questions about operations. A woman who had walked 5 miles in July and spent her last dollar on supplies for a job she wasn't sure she'd get. She was asking to help run his ranch. Every practical instinct he had said to keep her in the kitchen, where her skills were already proving their value, and to leave the business side to himself and Tom. But the practical instincts that had been guiding him for 6 years had gotten him $2,300 in debt and counting, and he was running out of reasons to trust them. My office, he said, tonight, after dinner. Bring that notebook. Something crossed her face, surprise or perhaps the quiet satisfaction of a plan coming together exactly as she'd calculated it would. She nodded once. I'll be there, she said. That night, Eliza spread her notebook across Daniel's desk with hands that were only barely steady. She had been taking notes since her second-day careful observations made while reviewing kitchen supplies and talking to the hands and listening to Tom Crawford's offhand comments about operations. She had compared the ranch's patterns against what she knew from 6 years running the supply chain for a 300-person hotel. The picture was not good, but it was clear, and clarity was the beginning of something fixable. Your feed supplier is overcharging by 15%, she said, opening the notebook to the first set of figures. I compared your invoices to the posted prices at the general store in Juniper Creek. You're paying a premium rate for standard grain, and he's counting on you not having time to comparison shop. She turned the notebook to face him. These are your invoices for the last 8 months side by side with the current market rates. Daniel stared at the columns of numbers. How did you get my invoices? Tom showed them to me. Her voice was level. I asked if there was anything I should know about the ranch's supply needs. He assumed I meant for cooking purposes. And you didn't correct him? No. She held his gaze without flinching. I didn't. He could have stopped there. He could have said that she'd gone beyond what he'd authorized, that she'd deceived his foreman, that he wasn't comfortable with the way she moved through information that wasn't hers to seek. All of it would have been fair. Instead, keep going. Something shifted in her expression, not relief exactly, but a settling, like a door finding its frame. Your cattle buyer in Fort Worth is recording false weights at the stockyard. She turned a page. He marks your cattle 5 to 10 pounds lighter per head than they actually weigh and pockets the difference. I spoke with one of the hands who went on your last drive and described the weighing process to me. The numbers your buyer reported don't match the physical descriptions. Daniel's hands went flat on the desk. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime. She flipped another page. Your fence wire supplier sold you substandard barbed wire on the last 2 orders. Half of it is already breaking. That's why your north fence is failing. Not age, not cattle pressure. Inferior material. A pause. And your neighbor, Mr. Calvin Briggs, has been quietly purchasing water rights upstream from your eastern pasture. 3 separate parcels in the last 18 months. I checked the county land records. She pointed to the map she had sketched in the back of the notebook. He's positioning himself to control the water supply to your best grazing land. The silence that followed was complete. Outside, a night bird called twice and went quiet. Daniel stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window, his back to her, staring at the darkness where his ranch lay. The ranch that was apparently being dismantled by men he'd done business with for years, by a neighbor he'd always thought was simply ambitious, by a system of small and consistent thefts that had never been large enough to see clearly but had accumulated into ruin. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. His voice came out rough. Eliza was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had a different quality, less professional, more true. "Because this ranch gave me a chance when I had nothing." A pause. "And because watching someone lose everything to men who cheat makes me angry in a way I can't quite explain." He turned to face her. "You don't know me." "No." Her eyes held his steadily. "But I know what it's like to start over with nothing. I know what it's like when people assume you're worth less than you are because of what you are." Something moved in her expression. Old pain carefully managed but present. "And I know that you're a decent man trying to do right by the people who depend on you even when it's killing you." The words landed too close to something true. Daniel looked away. "What do you want?" he asked. The real answer. "Not room and board." The silence stretched long enough that he looked back at her. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not the professional composure, not the strategic calm, but something stripped down and genuine. "I want to use the skills I have," she said finally. "I want to help fix something that's broken, and I want to go to sleep at night knowing I've done something that matters." A pause. "In Chicago, I had all of that, and then I lost it because I told the truth about people who didn't want the truth told." She held his gaze. "This ranch, this place that barely knows me, is the only place that's given me a chance to be useful again. I don't want to waste it." Daniel stood at the window for a long time after that, looking at the darkness and the stars and the outline of the land his father had broken his body to build. He thought about drowning alone versus the risk of trusting someone he didn't fully understand. He thought about the ledger on his desk and the $2,300 and the 6 months of short-weight flour and the corrupt buyer in Fort Worth and Calvin Briggs buying water rights parcel by quiet parcel. He thought about Eliza Hartley walking 5 miles in July with her last dollar spent on flour. "All right," he said, "show me what to do." For the first time since she'd walked into his yard, something broke through Eliza's composure. Not a full smile, but the hint of one quick as light on water. She opened her notebook to a clean page. First, she said, "We document everything." They worked until past midnight, going through every account, every invoice, every scrap of paper that documented Red Creek Ranch's business over the past 2 years. And with every page turned, Daniel felt something change in his chest. Not the sudden lifting of a burden, but something subtler and more durable, the beginning of the sense that the burden could be carried because it was no longer entirely his to carry alone. When Eliza finally stood to leave, she paused at the door. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "I need you to understand something." He looked up from the ledger. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here to help you keep what's yours." Her voice was quiet and completely certain. "I need you to believe that." He held her gaze for a moment. "I believe you." She nodded once, the economy of a woman who understood that some things didn't need elaboration, and pulled the door softly closed behind her. Daniel sat alone in the lamplight, surrounded by 2 years of records and the neat, precise handwriting of a woman who had walked into his failing life and handed him a rope. Outside, the Texas night pressed against the windows, vast and dark and full of the sounds of the land he was not done fighting for. For the first time in 2 years, he felt something other than the weight of inevitable loss. He felt the first dangerous stirring of hope. And hope, he was beginning to understand, was what made men fight back. The fighting back started before the sun rose. Daniel was on his second cup of coffee when Eliza appeared in his office doorway, dressed and alert, carrying a sheaf of papers and the notebook she'd had with her constantly for the past 2 weeks. She set everything down on his desk with the brisk efficiency of a general who has already run the morning's battle plan in her head and found it sound. "We're switching feed suppliers today," she said without preamble. "Miller's Feed in Austin will deliver for 20% less than what you're currently paying. I've already sent them a telegram." Daniel looked up slowly. "You sent a telegram?" "Yes." "With whose authority, Mama?" "Yours." She didn't blink. "I signed your name. If you want to fire me for it, do it after the feed arrives. You'll save money either way." The silence that followed had a complicated texture. He should have been furious. She had forged his signature on a business communication. She had made a decision that wasn't hers to make. Every practical instinct he had said that this was exactly the kind of overreach that led to chaos on a ranch, the kind of thing that had to be addressed firmly and immediately. Instead, he found himself pressing his lips together against something that was almost amusement. He took a deliberate sip of his coffee. "Efficient," he said carefully. "There's a difference between that and impossible." "No, there is," she agreed pleasantly and pulled out the chair across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. "We also need to discuss the cattle drive. It's scheduled for 6 weeks from now. If we're going to expose the buyer in Fort Worth, we need evidence that will hold up something that doesn't rely on one cowhand's memory of a weighing process." "What kind of evidence?" "Documented weights, from a scale that can't be disputed." She leaned forward slightly. "Which means we need to bring our own to Fort Worth." Daniel set down his cup. "A scale will cost money we don't have. The hardware store in Juniper Creek rents them. $15 for the duration of the trip." $15 might as well be $1,500 right now. "Then we earn it." Her voice was matter-of-fact, the tone of someone who has already done the arithmetic and is waiting for the other person to catch up. "We have 6 weeks. We cut costs. We sell what we can spare. We save every available dollar." "You sound very certain that's possible." "I am certain because I've already started." She slid a paper across the desk. "Yesterday morning, I sold your surplus salt pork to the hotel restaurant in Juniper Creek. $8. I also negotiated a trade arrangement with the blacksmith. He'll repair tools at half price in exchange for one beef delivery per month. That's another $6 saved in the first month alone." She paused. "Yesterday afternoon, I reorganized the tack room with Tom's help. We found 3 saddles you'd forgotten you owned and 2 bridles worth repairing and reselling. I've already spoken to the saddle shop in town." Daniel stared at her across the desk. "You did all that yesterday." "I did all that yesterday morning." Something that was almost a smile touched her mouth. "In the afternoon, I also reorganized the dry goods storage and found 4 months of accumulated waste from improper rotation. We were throwing away money every week simply because food was being used out of order." He was quiet for a moment. "You're supposed to be cooking." "I am cooking. The men ate breakfast an hour ago. Lunch is prepared and will keep. Dinner is planned." She stood gathering her papers with clean efficiency. "Cooking takes 4 hours of my day, Mr. Whitaker. I have 20 hours left. I intend to use them." She left before he could formulate a response. Daniel sat in his office for a long moment, looking at the paper she'd left on his desk at the $8 from the hotel and the projected savings from the blacksmith arrangement, and tried to decide how he felt about a woman who reorganized his ranch while feeding 8 men 3 meals a day. He was still trying to decide when Tom appeared in the doorway, shaking his head slowly. "Boss," his foreman said with the careful tone of a man recalibrating a lifetime of assumptions, "she just reorganized my entire tack room." "I know." "And without asking." "I know." Tom was quiet for a moment. "Thing is," he said finally, "it's better. Everything's better. I can actually find things." A pause. She put little labels on the pegs. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. She's going to reorganize the entire ranch, Tom said, whether we like it or not. I think she already has, Daniel said. We just haven't noticed yet. Tom was right. Over the following 2 weeks, Eliza proved it conclusively and with a consistency that might have been unsettling if the results weren't so undeniable. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for approval. She assessed a problem, determined the solution, and implemented it with the calm inevitability of a natural process, the way water finds its level or fire finds air. The tools that had been disappearing in the barn stopped disappearing because she created a system and posted it on the wall in clear handwriting. The rotation schedule for the hands that had been leaving gaps in coverage was rewritten with an efficiency that embarrassed its original author. The nail supplier, who had been delivering short quantities for 3 months, got called out at the loading dock with his own delivery records, as evidence received no further business from Red Creek Ranch, and was replaced by a competitor who charged less and delivered correctly. The hands stopped grumbling about a woman giving orders. They started coming to her with problems. Daniel heard Billy asking Eliza's opinion on the best method for treating a rope burn. He heard old Jack, who had been working cattle since before Daniel was born, asking her to look at the new feed schedule because something about the timing felt off to him. He heard Tom himself, Tom Crawford, who had 30 years of ranching knowledge and a manner that brooked precisely no nonsense, asking for her assessment of a contract he'd been offered by a supplier in San Antonio. She was becoming the center of gravity around which Red Creek Ranch organized itself, and she had been there less than a month. The moment that shifted something in Daniel's chest was quieter than any of these things. He came into the barn in the late afternoon to find Eliza and Billy sitting together on a hay bale, a worn primer open between them, Billy's brow furrowed with the concentration of someone for whom every syllable required deliberate effort. "Sound it out," Eliza was saying, her voice patient and completely without condescension. "You know this one." "Rrr." Billy squinted at the page. "Ranch. Ranch, that's right, next line." Daniel stopped in the doorway. He could have announced himself, but he didn't. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly when Billy had moved on to the next sentence, and Eliza glanced toward the door. She looked at him with mild surprise. "He asked. I said yes. I can't pay you extra for teaching." "I didn't ask you to." She turned back to the page as if the matter were settled because, in her mind, it clearly was. "Next line, Billy." Daniel retreated from the barn and stood in the yard for a moment, doing nothing in particular. A hotel kitchen manager from Chicago, sitting in a dusty Texas barn, teaching a 19-year-old cowhand to read because he'd asked her to. He thought about that for a long time. Okido. That night, she was in the kitchen again with the lamp and the notebook, her pen moving with the precise efficiency of someone who thinks in organized columns. "You should sleep," Daniel said from the doorway. "So should you." She didn't look up. And yet here we are. He crossed the kitchen and pulled a chair out across from her, sitting down without invitation in the way he was beginning to realize she had normalized in him the casual ease of two people who have been working closely enough that formality has become unnecessary. "We're $4 short on the feed payment," she said, turning the ledger to face him. "I can't account for the discrepancy. It's been bothering me since this afternoon." He looked at the numbers. 20 minutes later, they had a calculation error from 3 months ago, compounded by subsequent entries that had treated the error as accurate. $4 vanished into bad arithmetic, growing as it went. "This," Eliza said, tapping the ledger, "is why you're failing." He looked up at that. The word failing usually landed like an accusation. From her, it sounded like a diagnosis. "Not because you're a bad rancher," she continued, and her voice had shifted from professional to something quieter and more direct. "Because you're doing everything alone. No one can manage a cattle operation, maintain supply, relationships, negotiate contracts, keep accurate books, oversee 8 hands, and still have time to actually know what's happening on the land. It's not possible. It was never possible. I didn't have a choice. You do now." She closed the ledger. Her eyes met his across the lamplight. "You have me." The words settled into the kitchen with a weight that surprised him. Not because they were unexpected. The partnership they'd been building over the past 3 weeks was obvious to anyone paying attention, but because of the way she said them, not as a pitch or a proposal, as a statement of fact. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked. "The truth, Eliza, not the version you think I want to hear." She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. "Then, because in Chicago I was exceptional at my job, the best they had." Her hands rested still on the closed ledger, "and they destroyed me for it." He waited. "The hotel owners were stealing from their staff," she said, "timming wages across the entire operation, not small amounts, but systematic, deliberate theft building up over years. I documented it. I reported it to the right people." A pause and something moved behind her eyes. "And they fired me, blacklisted me across the industry, and told everyone who asked that I was a troublemaker, a liar, and a woman who didn't know her place." The anger that rose in Daniel's chest was fast and clean and certain. "It's what powerful men do when they're caught," she said without heat. "They make the person who caught them the story instead of themselves." She looked at him evenly. "I came to Texas because no one here has heard their version of events. Because out here my work can speak louder than their rumors." A pause. "It already does." The sounds of the ranch at night filled the silence, the distant movement of cattle, the creak of the house settling in the cooling air, the faint stirring of wind through the window screen. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, "that they did that." Eliza looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she opened the notebook to a fresh page. "Thank you," she said. "Now, about the water rights." Damn. The night riders came 3 weeks after Eliza arrived. The sound of hoofbeats in the dark was not unusual on a working ranch. The sound of multiple horses moving fast at 10:30 on a Tuesday night was another thing entirely. Daniel had the rifle off the wall before Tom's boots hit the porch boards. "Briggs," Tom said, appearing in the doorway. His face was set. "5 riders. He's at the gate." Eliza had appeared from the kitchen, her apron still on, her expression shifting from startled to resolved in the time it took Daniel to reach the door. "Stay inside," he said. "Like hell," she said, and followed him out. Calvin Briggs sat his horse in the yard like a man who owned the ground beneath it, which was Daniel had come to understand precisely the effect he was going for. He was a big man, broad across the chest, with the kind of physical presence that had probably intimidated most people he had ever met. Behind him, 5 riders spread in a loose arc, their hands visible and their horses still. "Whitaker." Briggs's voice was jovial in the way of men who don't need to be menacing because the threat is implicit. "Working late." "What do you want, Briggs?" "Just being neighborly." The big man's gaze moved past Daniel to Eliza, and something shifted in his expression, a recalculation quick and subtle. "Didn't realize you'd hired Chicago help. Must be getting desperate." Daniel kept his voice level. "State your business or ride out." "My business is simple." Briggs leaned forward in the saddle, easy and unhurried. "I'm buying the Thompson water rights next week. You know, the ones, that creek that feeds your east pasture. Thought you should know ahead of time in case you wanted to make me an offer for continued access." He smiled. "Say 10% of your cattle profits per year for guaranteed water rights." The number landed like a physical blow. 10% of cattle profits on a ranch that was already operating in the red was not a business arrangement. It was a slow strangulation. "That's extortion," Daniel said. "That's business." Briggs's voice didn't change. "You've got a week to decide. After that, the price goes up." He wheeled his horse, his men following in a practiced pivot. But before they cleared the gate, he called back over his shoulder, his voice carrying clearly across the still night air. "Nice meeting you, Miss Hart. Chicago must have been very glad to see you go." The words landed like a slap across open skin. Eliza went still. Daniel started forward, the rifle moving, and her hand closed on his arm with surprising strength. "Don't." Her voice was quiet and absolutely steady. "That's exactly what he wants." They watched the riders dissolve into the darkness. Tom spat in the dirt. "How did he know about Chicago?" Daniel asked when the sound of hoofbeats had faded to nothing. Someone talked. Eliza's voice was flat, stripped of everything except the bare fact. "Someone always does." She released Daniel's arm and turned back toward the house, and if her hands were shaking slightly in the darkness, she moved fast enough that he might have imagined it. "It doesn't change what we have to do." Inside, she spread a hand-drawn county map across the kitchen table, the same map she'd sketched from the county records office during her unexplained 3-day absence 2 weeks ago, and pointed to the creek drainage running north to south through the territory Briggs had been accumulating. The Thompson water rights are attached to a parcel with an existing easement, she said. Her voice had the quality it took on when she was working, focused clean ahead of whatever she was describing. Old Spanish land grant recorded in 1847. If someone files a challenge to the sale on historical grounds, the transaction gets tied up in court review for months, possibly longer. Daniel looked at the map. How do you know about a Spanish land grant from 1847? Because I spent 3 days in the county clerk's office. She looked up at him, and in her eyes was the quiet certainty of someone who has done the work before asking for credit. The easement is recorded. It's real. It's been sitting in those records for 35 years waiting for someone to look. Filing a challenge costs money. Not if we file ourselves. She was already writing the pen, moving in those neat, precise columns. I can draft the legal document. You submit it at the county seat. It won't stop him permanently, but it will buy us time. A pause. Time to get to Fort Worth. Time to expose the buyer. Time to build the resources to fight him properly. Daniel looked at the map, at the hand-drawn easement lines, at the notation in her handwriting of the record book and page number where the original grant was filed. He thought about the ledger and the $4 error they'd found together, and the 8 men who were eating properly for the first time in months, and Tom Crawford's labels on the tackroom pegs. Draft it, he said. I'll take it to the county seat in the morning. No, she didn't look up from the page. I'll take it. You need to be here. A pause. And I want to be the one who files it. He understood without her saying it why that mattered. Let her be the one to strike the first direct blow. Let that be hers. All right, he said. She rode out before first light and came back at dusk with dust in her hair and something bright and fierce in her face. Filed, she said. The clerk says Briggs is going to be furious. Good, Daniel said. Let him be furious. That night they celebrated with the hands, not lavishly because lavish was beyond them, but genuinely. Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey he'd been conserving for an occasion worth the sacrifice. Billy produced a harmonica from somewhere and played it with more enthusiasm than precision. The men told stories that got taller with each round, and Eliza laughed at Tom's genuinely terrible jokes with the unself-conscious pleasure of someone who hasn't laughed freely in a long time. Daniel sat at the end of the table and watched her and felt something stir in his chest that he was not yet ready to name. She caught him watching, raised her glass in a small salute. He raised his in answer, and she smiled. Not the professional expression, not the strategic composure, but something real and unguarded, and he looked away because the alternative was staring, and staring would require him to acknowledge what he was feeling. The celebration died in under 60 seconds when Pete Larkin came thundering into the yard. Pete was a steady man, not given to alarm. He'd once finished mending fence with a broken hand rather than interrupt the workday. The state of his horse and his face told Daniel everything before Pete had pulled his mount to a stop. The north fence, Pete said, his chest heaving. Someone cut it, clean through in 3 places. We've got cattle scattered across the north pasture and moving toward the creek. The whiskey was abandoned. Lanterns appeared. Daniel was in the saddle before most of the men had their boots on, and Eliza was beside him, already mounted with the calm efficiency of someone who has decided that asking permission for things would take too long. How many head, she asked Pete as they rode. 40, maybe 45. At current prices, 45 head was close to $600. Money they could not lose. The fence had been cut 3 times, each cut clean and deliberate, not the rough damage of panicked cattle or a downed post, but the work of wire cutters and intention. Eliza crouched beside the nearest cut in the lamplight and studied the ground with focused attention. The tracks go north, she said, toward Briggs's property line. We can't prove it was him, Daniel said. His voice was controlled, but his hands were not. We can follow the tracks. She stood and swung back into the saddle. If the cattle crossed onto his land, we have the legal right to retrieve them. And if he tries to claim them as his, we have witnesses and daylight ahead of us. Her voice was level and forward-looking, the voice of someone who has already processed the outrage and arrived at the response. We're not losing 45 head because a man thinks he can take whatever he wants. That's not how this goes. They tracked the cattle north for 2 hours through darkness. that smelled of cedar and damp limestone. Following the sound and the lantern light and the pressed grass trail through country, Daniel knew by feel more than sight. They found the herd in a shallow box canyon at the edge of Briggs's northern boundary, not quite across the line but close. Close enough that by morning they would have been. The intentionality of it settled over Daniel like cold water. He planned this, he said. Yes. Eliza was already assessing the canyon opening, calculating the best angle to move the cattle. And he'll plan the next one, which is why what we do in Fort Worth matters more than anything else we've tried. They drove the herd home through the dark, working in the near silence of tired people with a purpose, and repaired the fence with materials they couldn't afford, and did it anyway because the alternative was losing what they'd fought to keep. By the time the sun came up, Daniel was exhausted in every direction a person could be exhausted. He was also without quite choosing to be angrier than he'd been in years. Not the hot anger that burned itself out, but the cold variety that sets and hardens and becomes resolve. He found Eliza in the barn, unsaddling her horse with mechanical efficiency, her face drawn with the same fatigue. He's escalating, she said without turning. I know. It won't be the last time. I know that too. He pulled his own saddle off and hung it on the rack. What I don't know is how to guard every fence line every night. We don't have the hands for it. We don't guard it, she said. We make him pay for it when he tries again. Every time he crosses a line, we document it. We get witnesses. We build a record. She turned to face him, and in the gray morning light, her eyes were clear, despite the exhaustion behind them. When we get to Fort Worth, we make sure everyone in that territory knows exactly what kind of man Calvin Briggs is. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had arrived in his yard with a suitcase and spent her last dollar on flour. This woman who had turned his failing ranch into something that felt for the first time in years like it might survive. Who had filed a legal challenge against his most powerful neighbor and came back with dust in her hair and a fierce light in her face. You're not what I expected, he said. Neither are you. Her voice was quiet. I expected a man who'd given up. I found someone worth fighting for. The words sat between them in the morning air, doing something complicated to the space. Daniel looked away first. You should sleep. We both should. She crossed the barn toward the door and paused. Don't say whatever you're about to say, she said without turning. Not yet. Not until this is over. He stood in the empty barn for a long time after she left, listening to the sounds of the ranch waking around him, and tried to decide whether what he felt was gratitude or something that had no safe name yet. The 4 weeks before the cattle drive were the hardest in the best of Daniel Whitaker's ranching life, and he understood only afterward that those two things were not a contradiction. Hard because every day brought a new problem, a new calculation, a new decision made with insufficient money and insufficient time. Hard because Calvin Briggs made 2 more attempts at disruption, a false report to the county sheriff about cattle straying onto his land, and a visit from a lawyer with a letter full of impressive language and no actual legal standing that Eliza dismissed in under 4 minutes. Hard because the accumulated exhaustion of running a ranch while simultaneously preparing for a legal confrontation in Fort Worth and monitoring every fence line for wire cutters left all of them operating at the edge of their endurance. Best because every hard thing was met with 2 people working, and the difference between 1 person facing a wall and 2 people facing it together was not just quantitative. It changed the nature of the wall. Eliza found a new feed supplier who delivered full weight and charged less. She renegotiated the arrangement with the Juniper Creek Hotel to increase the salt pork sales. She worked with Tom to restructure the cattle rotation in a way that improved grazing efficiency enough to reduce feed costs by nearly 8%. She kept the books to the penny and caught 2 more vendor discrepancies and drafted 3 legal letters that Daniel signed and filed and taught Billy and 2 other hands to read with the steady patience of someone who understood that literacy was not a luxury, but a tool. And every night late after the hands were asleep and the ranch had quieted to its nighttime sounds, she and Daniel sat in his office or at the kitchen table and talked about the drive, about Fort Worth, about the buyer they were going to expose and the strategy they were building to do it, about the ranch's future if they succeeded and the contingencies if they didn't. Somewhere in those late nights, without either of them marking the moment the conversation stopped being only about the ranch. They talked about his wife who had died 3 years ago of a fever that should have been treatable, and wasn't because the nearest real doctor was 40 miles away. About the loneliness that had become so familiar, he'd almost stopped noticing it. About the way failure looks from the inside, not like a single catastrophic event, but like a long, slow erosion that you only recognize as catastrophic when you look back at how far you've come from where you started. She talked about Chicago in pieces the way people talk about things they're still assembling into something they can live with. About a job she had loved with the entirety of her professional self. About the man she'd thought understood her, who had stood quietly aside while her employers dismantled her reputation because speaking up would have complicated his own position. About the year between the hotel and Red Creek Ranch places and arrangements she described in the careful way of someone who has decided not to dwell. Daniel listened to all of it without advice or judgment, and in return she listened to him with the same quality of attention, total unhurried, the kind that makes the person talking feel for once that what they're saying is being actually received. They were becoming friends. Both of them knew it. Neither of them said it because the word felt both too small and too safe. 3 days before the drive, Briggs made his most sophisticated move yet. A lawyer arrived from Austin, not the bluster and no substance letter this time, but a proper attorney with a proper filing. A claim that Daniel owed Briggs $2,000 for water access over the past 5 years, based on a clause in a land agreement from his father's time that Briggs claimed had never been honored. The lawyer delivered it with professional apology and genuine sympathy. "I'm not here to take sides," he said. "I'm just delivering the paperwork. But you will need to respond in court. The filing is official." Court meant costs, more money they didn't have. After the lawyer left, Daniel found Eliza in the kitchen with her hands gripping the counter edge, her knuckles white. "This is my fault," she said. He stopped. "What?" "The water rights challenge I filed." Her voice was tight. "I told you it would make him angry. I told you he'd retaliate. I didn't account for how." She turned to face him, and her expression carried the particular heaviness of a person applying a higher standard to themselves than to anyone else. "If I'd thought it through better—" "This is Briggs's fault," Daniel said with a certainty that surprised him by how readily it came. "Not yours. His choices are his. We can't afford a lawyer. We can't afford to lose the ranch either." "Those aren't the only options." "Yes, they are." He crossed to the counter and leaned against it beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched. "We go to Fort Worth, we expose the buyer, we make enough on this drive to fight Briggs properly, and then we come back and we deal with the rest." He paused. "Together." She looked at him with the careful attention of someone determining whether the word means what it sounds like it means. "Together," she said quietly. "All right, together." Tisha. The night before the drive, the entire ranch gathered for a final meal that Eliza had spent 2 days preparing in the spaces between every other thing she was doing. Real beef, fresh bread, a pie made from preserved fruit that she had been saving in the back of the pantry for an occasion that merited it. The men ate and laughed and told stories with the particular intensity of people about to do something difficult, building themselves up for it, without quite acknowledging that's what they were doing. Tom told a story about his first cattle drive that was probably 40% accurate and 100% entertaining. Billy played harmonica with the same enthusiastic imprecision as before, and somehow it suited the evening perfectly. Daniel stood and raised his glass. "To Fort Worth," he said, "to honest dealing, and to the best cook in the state of Texas who also apparently does everything else." The men cheered. Eliza shook her head, but the color in her face was warm. Across the table in the lamplight and the noise, she caught his eye. And what passed between them in that look, brief, uncalculated, entirely unguarded, was something that neither of them tried to put a name to. Later in the quiet after the celebration had wound down, Eliza found Daniel on the porch looking out at the dark. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That's somewhere out there," he said. "Calvin Briggs is planning his next move." "Yes. And tomorrow we start making sure that it doesn't matter what he plans." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid?" He thought about it honestly. "Yes." "Good." She sat down in the other chair. "Fear means you understand what's at stake. The people who aren't afraid are the ones who don't know what they stand to lose." "What about you?" he asked. "Terrified," she said without hesitation. And then, "But I'd rather be terrified on the road to Fort Worth than safe on a porch watching someone else decide what happens to this ranch." Daniel almost said something then. The words were right there, the kind of words you say when the darkness is thick enough and the person beside you is close enough and the moment is finally wide enough to hold them. Instead, get some sleep. We ride before dawn. Good night, Daniel, she said. The first time she'd used his name without the formality of the title. She said it like she'd decided it was all right now, that permission wasn't required. Good night, Eliza, he said, and he sat on the porch after she'd gone inside, listening to Texas settle into its nighttime sounds, and thought that whatever happened in Fort Worth, he would face it differently than he'd faced anything in the last 6 years. He would face it knowing that the person beside him saw everything, all of it, the failing and the fighting, and the hope he'd been afraid to have and had chosen to stay anyway. The drive began in the iron-gray hour before sunrise, 200 head, moving in the reluctant way that cattle always moved in the dark, shoulder to shoulder, unhurried, indifferent to the urgency of the people managing them. Daniel rode at the point. Tom anchored the drag. Billy and 5 other hands worked the flanks with the focused energy of men who understood that 3 days of hard riding lay ahead and had decided to meet it directly. Eliza rode beside the supply wagon, which she had packed with the thoroughness of someone who considered every contingency, including the ones no one else had thought to mention. The rented scale was secured beneath canvas in the wagon bed. She had brought extra paper, multiple accounting ledgers, and the 3 separate copies of the documentation she and Daniel had assembled over the past month. She had also brought, packed carefully in waxed paper, 3 days' worth of meals prepared in advance, so the drive's cooking requirements wouldn't slow them down. Tom discovered the meals on the first midday rest and looked at the canvas-covered provisions with an expression that a man of his temperament rarely allowed himself. "She made us lunch," he said to no one in particular, with the reverence of a man who has spent too many cattle days eating pulled beans and trail dust. "She made us actual lunch before we left." "Don't make it strange," Billy said, and already reaching for the bread. They made good time that first day, better time than Daniel had expected, in part because Eliza's observation about the water barrels proved correct. She had worked it out from the maps she'd studied. They were carrying 40 gallons more than the 3-day requirement given the creek crossing at the midpoint. Dumping the excess shaved enough weight from the wagon to noticeably improve their pace. "How does she know about creek drainage in country she's never ridden?" Tom asked, genuinely puzzled, as they watched the water being decanted into the parched ground. "She spent 3 days in the county clerk's office," Daniel said. Tom processed this, reading maps, and water rights records and land surveys, and whatever else was in there. "Jesus," Tom said with the tone of a man adjusting his estimate of a situation significantly upward. The following riders appeared at mid-afternoon, 4 of them hanging at the edge of visibility, close enough to be seen, far enough to be deniable. When Daniel dropped back to assess, he recognized the silhouette of Rake Dennison Briggs foreman on a horse he'd seen before. "How long?" he asked the hand who'd flagged him. "Hour maybe, just staying at range." Daniel returned to the front of the herd and rode beside Eliza's wagon. "Briggs sent riders," he said, 4 of them, following at distance. She didn't look up from the ledger balanced on her knees. "What do they want?" "To make us nervous, to see if we make mistakes." "Then we don't make mistakes." She noted something in the ledger and turned a page. "Nervous people make errors. Mistakes in Fort Worth will cost us more than anything Rake Dennison can do from half a mile back. You recognize his silhouette from here?" "I recognize his horse." She glanced up. "It has an unusual gait, left front carries slightly high. I noticed it the night Briggs came to the ranch." A pause. "What are you going to do about them?" "Nothing, for now. If they get closer?" "If they get closer, we note it, we document it, and we keep moving." She returned to the ledger. "That's all." Daniel rode back to the front of the herd and told Tom, who spat expressively and said nothing. They kept moving. That night, camped on the flat ground south of the Austin Road, with the distant lights of Fort Worth, a theoretical promise on the dark horizon, Rake Dennison rode into the firelight. Alone, hands visible. The professional courtesy of a man delivering a message who wants to make it back home. "Mr. Briggs wants to make you an offer," Rake said. "Buy your whole herd, right now, fair price." Daniel looked at him across the fire. "What's fair?" 18 ahead, Vishana. The number dropped into the firelight and lay there. Market was 25 to 30, negotiated well. 18 was an insult dressed as an offer. Tell Briggs no, Daniel said. Rake's face was carefully neutral. You might want to think about it. Word's already reached the buyers in Fort Worth that Red Creek Ranch is coming in desperate. You're not going to do much better than 15, maybe 14, once they hear the full picture. A pause. Mr. Briggs's 18 is looking better the further north you get. Daniel rose from his seat by the fire, and something in his movement, not aggressive but certain, made Rake's horse step back. Go back to Briggs, he said. Tell him the answer is no. Tell him the answer will always be no. And tell him that what happens in Fort Worth tomorrow is going to change the conversation he thinks he's having. Rake studied him for a moment, then wheeled his horse and rode back into the dark. Every face around the fire was turned toward Daniel. Billy looked young and tense. The older hands wore the careful expressions of men calculating odds. Tom's face was unreadable in the way it got when he was waiting to see what the boss did before he committed himself. Eliza stood brushing dust from her skirt, her voice cutting through the quiet before Daniel could speak. We do what we planned, she said. We weigh our cattle on our scale. We document everything. We find honest buyers. She looked around the fire at each face in turn, unhurried. Briggs can talk to whoever he likes. What matters is what we prove when the sun comes up. And what we prove is that Red Creek Ranch deals straight, always has, always will. She sat back down and picked up the ledger. Get some sleep. We're moving at first light. The men settled. The fire crackled. Tom caught Daniel's eye across the flames and gave the smallest possible nod, the nod of a man who has updated his assessment again and found it considerably improved. Daniel lay on his bedroll an hour later, staring at the stars, and thought about what it would feel like to ride back to Red Creek Ranch with the drive complete and the buyer exposed and the future for once pointing in a direction that wasn't straight down. He thought about Eliza's face in the firelight, reading a ledger, while the rest of the camp processed their fear. He thought about everything she had said about being terrified and choosing to be terrified on the road rather than safe on the porch. And for the first time in a long time, he thought this might actually work. They reached the Fort Worth stockyards in the gray hour before most buyers arrived. This was deliberate. Eliza had worked out the timing with the same systematic logic she applied to everything, and she had been explicit about it. If they arrived when the yard was already busy, Rake Dennison's people would have had time to work the buyers to plant the story about a desperate ranch selling off a failing herd to set the narrative before Red Creek Ranch had a chance to set its own. Arriving at the edges of dawn meant they were setting up before the stage was prepared for them. The sail came off the wagon first. Tom and Billy carried it to the weighing station and set it beside the yard's official equipment with an efficiency that drew immediate attention from the yard manager, a heavy-set man named Croft, who appeared from his office with the expression of someone whose morning routine had been disrupted. You can't use a private scale on my yard, he said. We have official equipment. That's what everyone uses. We'll use both, Eliza said pleasantly before Daniel could respond. She was already unfolding the documentation she'd prepared: purchase records, estimated weights, a methodical accounting of Red Creek Ranch's herd. For verification, I'm sure you have no objection to a second check in the interest of accuracy. A pause, her voice staying light, her eyes steady. Unless there's a reason you'd prefer the official scale to be the only measurement on record. Croft's face went red. He opened his mouth. Eliza waited with the calm patience of a woman who has had this conversation in various forms many times amongst and knows exactly where it ends. Use whatever scale you want, Croft said, and retreated to his office. Tom let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. She's going to get us killed someday, he said with what sounded like pure admiration. Not today, Daniel said. Get the first steers into the chute. The discrepancy showed on the third animal. It wasn't subtle. 15 pounds, then 18 on the second steer, 14 on the third. The yard's official scale was reading consistently and significantly low. The kind of low that doesn't happen by equipment failure or calibration drift, but by design. Over 200 head of cattle at market prices, that discrepancy translated to the kind of money that made the back of Daniel's neck prickle. Stop, Eliza said. The whole weighing operation stopped. She walked to the official scale and examined it the way she'd examined that supply bag 3 weeks ago, with the focused attention of someone who already knows the answer and is confirming the evidence. "This scale is rigged," she said loudly. Not shouting, she never shouted, but clearly in the carrying voice of a woman who has learned that the difference between a statement and an accusation is volume. Buyers who had drifted in over the past hour stopped. Men from other operations, clerks, a livestock commission agent who had been making notes at the edge of the yard looked up from his ledger. Eliza did not wait for them to come to her. She turned to face the growing audience. "We have documentation of a consistent 15 to 20-pound discrepancy between this yard's official scale and an independently certified scale." She lifted her ledger. "Over 200 head. I can show you the numbers for each animal individually, or I can summarize this yard has been stealing from ranchers for months, possibly years, and I can prove it." The resulting conversation lasted 2 hours, during which the livestock commission agent stopped making notes in his ledger and started making very different ones, during which 3 other ranchers demanded their animals be reweighed, during which Croft appeared and disappeared from his office doorway several times, with the aspect of a man deciding whether flight was still an option, and during which Daniel found himself negotiating with a buyer from Kansas City named Hartwell, who had arrived in Fort Worth that morning with a substantial purchasing mandate and a thorough disgust for the discovery that his previous transactions here had been compromised. 28 per head, Hartwell said, extending his hand. "Certified weight on your scale. I'll want to establish a regular supply arrangement if the quality holds." Daniel shook it. "Quality holds," he said. Across the yard, Eliza was still speaking with the commission agent, her ledger open, her pen moving. She had the particular quality that a person gets when they are doing exactly what they are best at in exactly the circumstances that require it, completely in her element, completely alive. Tom appeared beside Daniel, watching the same thing. 28 ahead, he said. "That's the best price we've gotten in 4 years." "I know." She knew the scale was wrong before we even started weighing. She suspected it. She came prepared to prove it. Tom was quiet for a moment. "Boss, that woman." He stopped, started again. "I've worked ranches my whole life. I've known a lot of capable people." A pause. "She's something different." "Yes," Daniel said, "she is." "Dan." The trouble arrived in the form of a well-dressed man in an expensive suit at 11:15. Eliza saw him first, and the change in her face was the first warning Daniel had. Not fear. He'd never seen actual fear from her, even in the yard with Briggs's riders. Something more controlled and more complex, the particular alertness of someone encountering a danger they have thought about but hope not to meet. The man crossed the stockyard with the ease of someone accustomed to his own authority. He was perhaps 50, with the silver-templed look of Eastern money and the kind of smile that never extended past the lower half of his face. Rake Dennison was behind him. "Miss Hart," the man said. "What a remarkable coincidence." Eliza said nothing for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was the most controlled Daniel had ever heard it, which was saying something. "Mr. Webb." A pause. "Harrison Webb." "The same." Webb's smile held. "I heard there was some excitement at the stockyard this morning. Couldn't resist investigating." His gaze moved to Daniel with the assessment of a man pricing things. "You must be Whitaker." "What do you want?" Daniel said. "A conversation, a brief one." Webb's manner was the texture of a business negotiation, smooth, confident, already several steps ahead. "I represent interests that have been watching the Red Creek Ranch situation with some attention. You've had a difficult season, debt, legal complications, a difficult neighbor." A pause. "We'd like to simplify things for you." "We're not interested in simplification," Eliza said. "You haven't heard the offer." Webb reached into his coat and produced documents. $15,000 for the ranch and all its holdings, clear title, immediate transfer. You walk away with enough to start fresh somewhere without the complications. The number hung in the yard air. 15,000. It was enormous in the abstract. It was approximately half the ranch's real value, and everyone present knew it. "The ranch is not for sale," Daniel said. "Everything's for sale at the right price." Webb's voice remained pleasant. "Your debt is significant. Mr. Briggs has filed legal claims that will consume years of court costs. The buyers you've offended this morning," a gesture toward the commission agent, "will make future business complicated. This offer provides a clean exit." A pause. "Well, a generous one." "It's theft," Eliza said, "dressed in a suit and carrying papers." Something shifted in Webb's expression, the pleasantness receding just enough to show what was behind it. He turned to Eliza with a different quality of attention. "Miss Hart," he said, "you should be careful. Your reputation even here, even at this distance, is not exactly unblemished. I'd hate for people to learn the full account of what happened in Chicago." The threat was specific and deliberate. Eliza went very still. Daniel stepped forward. "Get off this yard." "This is a public yard, Mr. Whitaker." Webb reached back into his coat and produced a second set of documents. "And I'm afraid the situation has progressed beyond a simple offer." He extended the papers. "This is notification of foreclosure proceedings initiated at the request of Mr. Briggs. You missed a payment on your outstanding debt last month. That triggered a clause in your loan agreement. Red Creek Ranch will be transferred to a holding company by the end of the month unless the full amount is settled." He paused. "Which you cannot do, which is why the $15,000 is still available." Daniel took the papers. His hands were not shaking because he made them not shake. He scanned the document with the specific kind of focus that comes from understanding that what you're reading will determine the next year of your life. Eliza appeared beside him. She took the papers from his hands and read them with the speed of someone who reads documents for tactical content rather than narrative comprehension. He watched her eyes move across the pages, and he watched her expression change from something tight and controlled to something different. "The payment date is wrong," she said. Webb's head moved not a flinch, but adjacent to one. "This document says the payment was due the 5th of last month." Eliza said, her voice picking up the particular quality it took on when she was certain. "The payment was due the 15th. I have the original loan agreement in the wagon. I can produce it in 4 minutes." She looked at Webb directly. "The foreclosure notice references a missed payment on a date that doesn't exist. That means this document is either an error or a forgery." A pause. "Which is it?" The silence in the stockyard had a texture. "Furthermore," Eliza continued, "a foreclosure in Texas requires a legally filed notice delivered to the property owner at their registered address. No such notice has been filed with the county recorder's office because I checked 2 days ago and there was nothing." She held Webb's gaze with the steady intensity of someone who has spent the last month preparing specifically for this conversation. "You haven't filed anything. You're bluffing. The foreclosure is not legal yet." Ruth Morrison, the sharp-eyed attorney who had appeared beside them 3 minutes ago, having been telegraphed 2 weeks prior as a contingency measure, stepped forward with the brisk pleasure of a woman entering a fight she expects to win. "And I'm here to make sure it doesn't become legal," Morrison said. "Miss Hart, Mr. Whitaker, shall we?" Webb's expression had cycled through several things. What remained was the flat calm of a man who has lost a round and is calculating the next one. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Eliza agreed, "but today is." She turned away, which was in itself a statement. "Ruth, we need to talk about filing." "Yeah." By late afternoon, Morrison had documents in motion, complaints against the fraudulent foreclosure attempt, a formal record of the stockyard scale manipulations submitted to the Texas Livestock Commission, and preliminary filings in the Briggs water rights dispute that added the new evidence from the day's events. Webb had left the stockyard with Rake Dennison trailing behind him, both of them carrying the aspect of men who have been in bigger rooms than this one and know how to wait. Daniel and Eliza sat in the hotel where they'd taken rooms, the first decent accommodation either of them had been in for months, and went through Morrison's summary while the evening settled outside the windows. "He'll try again," Daniel said. "Yes," Eliza set down the summary, "but not the same way. We've closed this door." A pause. "He'll find a different one." "The Chicago situation." "Possibly." Her voice was steady. "He knows about it. He used it as a threat today. That means he'll try to use it properly. File something, send something. Do what those hotel owners weren't able to do from 1,500 miles away." She was quiet for a moment. "If they come after me legally, it could affect the partnership, affect everything we've built here." Daniel looked at her across the small table with its 2 chairs and its lamp burning against the night. He thought about what she'd said in the kitchen weeks ago about being good at something and being destroyed for it anyway, about choosing Texas because no one here had heard the lies. "Then we get ahead of it," he said. She looked at him. "We don't wait for them to bring whatever they're planning. We find out what it is, and we counter it before it lands." He leaned forward. You documented everything that happened in Chicago, didn't you? You said you kept records. A long pause. Yes. Then we build the case from your side. We find people who were there who know what happened. We make sure the truth is on record somewhere that can't be dismissed. He met her eyes. I'm not letting them do to you here what they did to you there, ma'am. Eliza looked at him with the particular expression she wore when she was recalibrating, when something was not what she'd expected, and she was adjusting to account for it. You don't have to do that, she said quietly. I know, he said. I want to. The words sat between them in the lamplight, simple, declarative, and considerably more than the surface of them. Thank you, she said with a directness that meant she wasn't filing it away or managing it, just receiving it. Thank you, Daniel. He nodded and turned back to the papers because the alternative was saying something that wasn't ready to be said yet, and he had learned from her example that timing was its own form of strategy. The telegram arrived the following morning while they were breakfasting. A rider brought it to the hotel with the expression of someone who suspects bad news and wants to be well away from it. Eliza's name on the front. Her face as she read it confirmed the suspicion. Chicago, she said. Her voice was controlled in the way that required effort. The hotel owners have filed a criminal complaint in Illinois. Theft and embezzlement. They're requesting extradition. Daniel felt cold certainty settle in his chest. When the complaint is dated 2 weeks ago, she set the telegram down. Someone told them where I was. They've been building the case while we were building ours. Tom appeared in the doorway, his face grim. Boss, there's a federal marshal in the lobby. Says he has papers for Miss Eliza. The next 30 seconds had the particular clarity of a moment a person knows they will remember in exact detail for the rest of their lives. Eliza straightened in her chair. She folded the telegram precisely along its original creases and set it beside her untouched coffee cup. She looked at Daniel across the table. I need you to trust me, she said. I do, he said without hesitation. She stood, and the expression that settled on her face was the one he had first seen in his yard 5 weeks, in what felt like a different lifetime ago, the steady, unafraid quality of a woman who has made her calculation and arrived at her answer. Then let's go see what they think they have, she said. The federal marshal was a tall man named Hicks, with professional courtesy and the particular wariness of someone who has delivered enough bad news to know that people respond unpredictably to it. He had 2 deputies behind him and papers from a federal court in Illinois that he presented with the careful formality of a man who believed in procedure. Eliza took the papers from his hands and read them with the speed that had become to Daniel one of the most recognizable things about her, that rapid, focused scan followed by the brief stillness of someone completing a calculation. This warrant names Eliza Hart, she said, unmarried woman formerly of Chicago, Illinois. That is correct, ma'am. My name is Eliza Whitaker. She looked up from the papers. I was married 3 weeks ago. My legal name has changed. This warrant describes a person who no longer exists in the eyes of Texas law. A pause, her voice staying level and unhurried. Unless you have documentation specifically naming Eliza Whitaker of Red Creek Ranch, your authority here is a question for a judge to settle. Hicks frowned. That's a technicality. The law is made of technicalities, Marshal. That's rather the point. She folded the papers and handed them back to him. I'm not attempting to evade anything. I'm asking you to verify your jurisdiction before we proceed. If you'd like to involve a judge, we're available. If you'd like to amend the warrant and return properly, we'll be here. A pause. Ruth Morrison is our attorney. I believe you may know her work. Morrison materialized from the hotel dining room as if she'd been waiting, which Daniel reflected she probably had been. She had the satisfied expression of a woman who has prepared 3 contingencies and watched the first one work. Marshal Hicks, she said pleasantly. Shall we sit down? The legal review that followed consumed the better part of 3 days. Morrison filed motions with the speed of someone who knew exactly which levers the system had and where to place a hand. Hicks, who turned out to be a fair man operating under instructions he hadn't written and didn't entirely trust, agreed to a pause in execution pending judicial review. The Illinois complaint was placed before a federal judge who agreed with evident irritation to examine the supporting evidence before approving extradition. Meanwhile, Daniel sent telegrams. 12 of them to former employees of the Clement Palace Hotel in Chicago, names Eliza provided from memory, cross-referenced against the notes she had kept from her time there, documents she'd carried in the bottom of her suitcase through everywhere she'd been since leaving. Names of people who had been there, who had seen what was stolen, who had watched a woman be destroyed for saying so. 7 responded, then 9, then 12. All 12 were willing to testify. Morrison read through the responses with the focused pleasure of a woman building a structure she knows will hold. They were stealing from the staff for years, she said. Wage skimming, supply fraud, doctored accounts. Your client documented all of it. They fired her and blacklisted her and told everyone she'd stolen from them because it's considerably easier to accuse the accuser than to defend yourself. She set the last telegram down. This isn't just a defense. This is a countersuit waiting to happen. Eliza sat across the table with her hands folded on the summary. She had read each telegram as it arrived, and each time she read one, something in her posture changed, not dramatically, not in any way most people would have noticed, but Daniel noticed because he had been watching her for weeks. The set of her shoulders eased fraction by fraction as the weight of being disbelieved redistributed itself into the weight of being proven right. 12 people, she said. 12, Morrison confirmed, all willing to appear or submit sworn statements. With the forged signature evidence we already have, the original complaint looks exactly like what it is, a retaliation designed to silence a witness. She paused. I'd say they made a mistake filing this. Pulling you into a federal review gave us a stage we wouldn't otherwise have had. That night, Daniel and Eliza sat on the small balcony of the hotel, and for the first time in weeks, neither of them was working or planning or preparing. The Fort Worth evening settled around them, the sounds of the city winding down, the smell of horses and dust, and the particular aliveness of a western town at dusk. 12 people, Eliza said again quietly. I didn't know if any of them would respond. Why wouldn't they? Because speaking up cost me everything. I wasn't sure anyone else would take that risk. She was quiet for a moment. Most people have more to lose than they have certainty. They came anyway. Yes. She looked out at the street below. They came anyway. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Eliza, I need to say something. She turned to look at him. I've been thinking about what you said, about Chicago, about being exceptional at something and being destroyed for it. He chose his words with the care of a man who has been rehearsing without quite knowing it. You weren't just good at your job. You were the kind of person who sees what's wrong and can't make themselves look away. That's not a professional skill. That's who you are. He met her eyes. And you came to Texas with nothing, and you gave everything you had to a failing ranch and a man too stubborn to ask for help because you couldn't look at something broken without trying to fix it. Eliza's expression had shifted into something unguarded. What I'm trying to say, he continued, is that I am grateful, not just for the ranch, for what you've done for the ranch, which is considerable, but for what you did for me, for what it feels like to face something difficult with someone beside you. He paused. I don't know how to say this well. I've been out of practice. You're doing fine, she said very quietly. I love you, he said, the non-business part of that, the part that has nothing to do with ledgers or water rights or corrupt buyers, the part that started somewhere around the time I found you in the barn teaching Billy to read and has been getting louder ever since. He looked at her steadily. I don't need you to say it back. I just need you to know it's true. For a moment, Eliza said nothing. The Fort Worth evening continued around them, indifferent and ordinary, which was the wrong word for what the moment felt like. Then she said, I bought the ranch. Daniel blinked. What? 3 days ago, while Morrison was filing the first motions. Her voice was steady and a little careful, the voice she used when she was delivering information she has calculated would land hard and has decided is necessary anyway. The loan had a buyout clause. If the full outstanding debt is paid before foreclosure proceedings are finalized, the paying party acquires a controlling interest. I paid it. She held his gaze. I had money in a Chicago bank from before. It was sitting there because I had nowhere to put it and nothing to spend it on. A pause. The ranch is legally mine now. Briggs cannot foreclose because there is no debt to foreclose on. The silence that followed had a particular quality. You bought my ranch, Daniel said. I protected it. Her voice was quietly fierce. There is a difference. Webb was preparing to execute that foreclosure the moment the paperwork cleared. Morrison confirmed it. If I hadn't acted in that window, Briggs would have had it by the end of the week. She leaned forward slightly. I bought it so that you could keep it. That was the only reason. The only one to... Daniel stood up. He walked to the railing and looked out at the street below, at the ordinary Fort Worth evening, at the world going about its business, while everything he had worked for existed in a form he hadn't agreed to. I trusted you, he said, and I didn't break that trust. Her voice was unwavering. Daniel, look at me. He turned. I am offering you equal partnership, she said. Equal ownership, equal decision-making, equal everything. The ranch stays yours. We run it together the way we've been running it, but with legal protection that neither of us can be separated from. She held his gaze with the absolute directness she brought to everything that mattered. I did not do this to control you. I did it because I could not stand there and watch Briggs take it. And because, somewhere in the last 5 weeks, her voice changed, becoming something less professional and more real. It stopped being just a ranch to me. It started being home. The word landed in the room like something permanent. A partnership, Daniel said after a long moment. Equal in everything. He looked at her for a long time. He thought about the ledger on his desk 2 months ago and the woman who'd walked 5 miles in the heat to save it before she even knew what it was worth. He thought about the labels on the tackroom pegs and Billy reading aloud from a primer and Eliza filing a legal challenge with dust in her hair and something fierce in her face. He thought about sitting at the kitchen table at midnight, finding a $4 error together and what she'd said, "You have me." He thought about what he'd just told her on this balcony and what she'd told him in return, even if she hadn't said it in words yet. I'll sign it, he said. Something broke through her composure then. Not tears, not quite, but the unguarded relief of someone who has been holding something very carefully for a very long time and has been given permission to set it down. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. He sat back down across from her. Just a pause. Tell me the rest of it, the thing you were going to say before you told me about the ranch. She looked at him for a moment. Then, I love you too, she said. I've been terrified of it since approximately the 3rd week, which is when I realized I was staying because of you, not because of the ranch. She held his gaze steadily. I've been doing everything I know how to do to protect what matters, and what matters is you and the home we're building and the future we haven't finished planning. A pause. So yes, I love you, the non-business part. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. She let him. The Federal Review concluded 6 days later in an Austin courthouse that smelled of cedar and old paper. The judge was a compact woman of 60 with the expression of someone who has been presented with too many poorly constructed arguments and does not intend to have patience for another one. She read Morrison's summary with the focused attention it deserved, examined the 12 sworn statements, and reviewed the forged signature on the original complaint documents with the aid of a clerk who confirmed in 20 seconds what Eliza had identified at a glance. This signature, the judge said, setting the document down, does not match the provided samples of Mrs. Whitaker's handwriting. The discrepancy is significant and consistent. She looked at the Illinois attorneys who were sitting across the table with the aspect of men beginning to understand how the day was going to go. The court finds no credible evidence of embezzlement by the respondent. The warrant is invalidated. A pause. Furthermore, the documentation provided by the respondent's counsel indicates a pattern of wage theft and financial fraud by the complainants over a period of several years. I'm referring this to the federal attorney's office for investigation. Morrison touched Eliza's arm briefly, the gesture of a woman who doesn't make them often. The Illinois attorneys stood and filed out without looking at anyone. The federal marshal who had been present throughout shook Daniel's hand on the way out with the crisp brevity of a man who respects a thing cleanly done. Outside the courthouse in the Austin morning light, Eliza stood completely still for a moment. She looked at the sky. She breathed. Then she looked at Daniel. It's over. It's over, he confirmed. She closed her eyes briefly, the only display of private feeling she allowed herself, and when she opened them, they were clear. The water rights auction is Tuesday, she said. He almost laughed. Yes, it is. We should leave by tomorrow morning to be there on time. We should. He fell into step beside her. Eliza. After the auction. Yes. We're going to talk about the rest of it. The part that isn't business. She was quiet for 3 steps. Then, all right, she said, after the auction. The water rights auction on Tuesday morning drew every rancher in the territory with an interest in the outcome of what had become over the past weeks the defining land dispute in the county. Calvin Briggs arrived with 3 men who had the look of serious financial backing and the manner of people who have come prepared to win at any price. He didn't look at Daniel when he walked in. He looked at Eliza. She looked back without expression, which was itself a kind of answer. The bidding opened at 10,000. Briggs went to 12. Red Creek Ranch went to 13. The numbers climbed with the deliberate patience of 2 parties who understood that speed was not the point, endurance was. At 17,000, Daniel caught Morrison's eye. She gave the smallest possible shake of her head. The investors they'd assembled could go to 18, possibly 19. Beyond that, they were beyond the range they'd secured. Briggs bid 18. His face was controlled, but the color in it told Daniel that he was at the edge of his range, too, or past it depending on how much his backers had agreed to extend. Eliza touched Daniel's arm. She leaned close. One more jump, she said very quietly. Large enough to make him think we have resources he hasn't accounted for. Either he folds because he's already at his limit, or he goes higher and breaks himself. If he doesn't fold, we lose. If we don't take the risk, we lose slower. She met his eyes. You said you'd rather be terrified with me than safe without me. I said that. I'm asking you to mean it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned to the auctioneer. 20,000, he said clearly. The room went very still. 20,000 was not a tactical bid. It was a statement of position, the kind of number you named when you wanted the other party to understand that their calculations about your resources were wrong. It was also at this moment at the outer edge of what Daniel Whitaker could survive financially if Briggs matched it. Briggs turned to the men behind him. The conversation was brief and not quiet enough. One of the men shook his head. Briggs argued, his voice rising, and the man shook his head, again the firm, definitive gesture of someone with authority over the money. The second backer stood and walked out. Briggs stood alone with his hands clenched and $20,000 sitting in the air between him and everything he'd spent 6 months trying to take. Going once, the auctioneer said. The courthouse was silent in the particular way of rooms full of people holding their breath. Going twice. Briggs's jaw worked. His hands were fists at his sides. He looked at Eliza with an expression that contained in layers Daniel could read from across the room, rage and the specific bitterness of a man who has finally understood that he was outplayed. He said nothing. Sold, the auctioneer said, to Red Creek Ranch at $20,000. The room exhaled. Morrison shook both their hands with restrained satisfaction. Several ranchers' men Daniel had known for years, men who had watched without intervening, came to offer congratulations with the slight awkwardness of people acknowledging that they had watched without intervening and were now trying to account for that. Briggs approached them alone, without his backers, without Rake Dennison, without the apparatus of threat and resource that had surrounded him for months. He was just a large man in a good suit who had bet everything on a strategy and discovered it wasn't enough. You beat me, he said. His voice was flat, stripped of the pleasantness it usually carried. I'll grant you that. It didn't have to be this, Eliza said. Not with heat, but with the directness she brought to things that were simply true. Honest competition, fair dealing. You could have been a neighbor instead of an opponent. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, not apology, not exactly, but a kind of recognition. My wife said the same thing, he said quietly. Said I'd let pride make a fool of me. A pause. Maybe she was right. He walked away. He didn't look back. Ruth Morrison appeared at Eliza's shoulder. The Briggs legal claims have been formally withdrawn as of this morning. He filed the withdrawal before the auction. A pause. I believe Mrs. Briggs may have had something to do with that. Good, Eliza said. Daniel took her hand. She looked at their joined hands for a moment, then looked at him, and what was in her face in that moment was everything that hadn't quite been said, every late night and early morning, every decision made together, every wall faced with 2 people instead of 1. Home, she said. Home, he agreed. Boy. They rode back to Red Creek Ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late September, when the Texas heat had begun its slow retreat and the light came in at a lower angle and turned everything it touched the particular gold of a season changing. The hands came out when they heard the horses. Billy was first, his face open with the relief of someone who has been waiting to hear that things went the right way. Tom appeared from the barn with the expression of a man who has been worried and is now carefully not showing how worried he has been. Well, Tom said, the water rights are ours, Daniel said. The legal challenges are dropped. Briggs is done. A pause. We're done fighting. The cheer that went up from 8 men in a ranch yard was not a large sound in the scheme of things, but it felt like one. That evening, Eliza cooked a meal that people talked about for years afterward, not because of any single element, but because of the quality of abundance. It had the sense of a table that had been set for people who had earned what was on it. She had planned it in her head on the road back, and she had produced it with the organized efficiency that was by now the most familiar thing about her. After dinner, after the stories and the whiskey and Billy's harmonica, after the hands had drifted to their bunks, and the ranch had settled into its nighttime quiet, Daniel and Eliza sat on the porch. The stars were out in the particular abundance of a clear Texas sky in September. The creek in its channel at the edge of the east pasture made the sound it had been making since long before anyone had thought to claim rights to it. You said after the auction, Eliza said. I did. We're after the auction. He turned to look at her in the dark. She was looking at the stars, and her profile in the faint light had the quality of something he wanted to memorize, not because he was afraid of losing it, but because it was worth the attention. I want to build something, he said, not just hold what we have. Build. Make Red Creek Ranch into something that matters beyond the two of us. He paused. I want to do that with you as partners. As partners in everything, she said quietly. Yes. I know we already signed the papers. The papers are the business part. Yes. He turned fully to face her. I'm asking about the other part. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. The creek made its sound. A night bird called once and went still. I spent 1.5 years, she said finally, believing that the safest thing I could do was not need anyone, not trust anyone, not want anything that another person could take away. A pause. And then I walked 5 miles in the July heat because I needed a second chance, and a man I'd never met gave me one. And everything I thought I'd learned about safety turned out to be wrong. Eliza, I want the other part, she said with the clean simplicity of someone who has made a decision and arrived at the other side of the fear. I want everything, the ranch and the work and the arguing about ledgers and the late nights and a pause, the rest of it, whatever comes next. She looked at him directly. I want it with you. He leaned forward and kissed her there on the porch in the September dark, and she kissed him back with the particular quality of someone who has been precise and strategic and careful for a very long time and has decided with full deliberate intention to be none of those things right now. When they pulled apart, she was smiling, the real one, the one that was only his to see. Equal partners, she said. In everything, he agreed. Decide. In the years that followed, Red Creek Ranch became known throughout that part of Texas for things that had nothing to do with its acreage or its cattle count. It was known for dealing straight in a territory where straight dealing had not always been the custom. For the partnership model that other ranchers slowly, skeptically, and then with increasing conviction began to adopt in their own operations. For the literacy program that Eliza expanded from 3 ranch hands to a regular weekly gathering that drew working men from 3 counties. For the quality of its supply relationships, every one of them renegotiated on terms that were specific and fair and documented in the neat handwriting that anyone who had done business with Red Creek Ranch came to recognize as the mark of a transaction that would be honored in full. For the woman who had walked 5 miles in the July heat for a second chance and had spent every day since then making that chance count. Billy Cates, who learned to read at a kitchen table in the barn, was foreman by the time he was 25. Tom Crawford, who retired 6 years after Fort Worth, told people at his retirement supper that the best thing he'd ever done was refuse to take no for an answer when a woman asked for work on a Tuesday morning. Calvin Briggs sold his northern properties the following spring and retired to San Antonio, where his wife Margaret was reported to look considerably happier. The water rights upstream from Red Creek's east pasture remained with Daniel and Eliza Whitaker, and passed to their children in due time. Margaret Webb, no relation to Harrison, who was indicted by the federal attorney's office, the following year moved to Juniper Creek and became one of Eliza's earliest students in the literacy program, which Eliza always said was the best of all possible endings to that particular story. And every morning in the office that had once held a man sitting alone with a ledger that spelled ruin, two people sat down together with the books and the plans and the work of a ranch that was, by every measure that mattered, thriving. Not because one of them had saved it, not because either of them had been exceptional or lucky or more capable than the odds against them, but because two people had looked at the same failing thing and decided together that it was worth fighting for. That was what Red Creek Ranch was built on in the end. Not luck, not land, not money. The decision made every single day to choose each other. And that, more than water rights, more than honest weights, more than a signed partnership agreement or a legal certificate from an Austin courthouse, was what made it last.